Good evening, everyone. My name is Chelsea Jackson, and I am the Director of Membership and Annual Giving here at the Cleveland Museum of Art. I just want to extend a warm welcome and a sincere thank you to each and every one of you, not just for being a member, but for braving the cold and joining us here tonight. Tonight's lecture is going to be an exclusive opportunity just for our members to hear from Picasso and Paper's presenting curator, Brittany Salisbury. Brittany joined the Cleveland Museum of Art in March 2018. During her time here at the CMA, she has organized exhibitions on topics including the watercolors of Charles Birchfield, contemporary women printmakers, Latin American works on paper, and most recently, Edgar Degas' representations of Parisian laundresses. Her 2023 exhibition, 19th Century French Drawings from the Cleveland Museum of Art, was accompanied by a catalog of this collection and received grant funding from the Getty Foundation and the Wolfgang Ratjen Foundation. Previously, she was Associate Curator of Prints and Drawings at the Milwaukee Art Museum, was a postdoctoral Mellon Curatorial Fellow at the Museum of Art, Rhode Island School of Design, and held research and fellowship positions in the drawings and prints departments of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Morgan Library and Museum, and the Art Institute of Chicago. Brittany's research and publications focus on 19th century European works on paper with a particular interest in technical art history and the history of collecting. She co-edited the book Collecting Prints, Posters, and Ephemera, Perspectives in a Global World. And she has contributed to numerous publications, including the journals 19th Century Art Worldwide and Print Quarterly. Brittany co-founded the Association of Print Scholars and serves on the boards of the Print Council of America and the Association of Historians of 19th Century Art. She works with students through the CMA and Case Western Reserve University's joint doctoral program in art history, and has previously taught on topics including modern art and the history of printmaking at the City University of New York, Christie's Education, and the Rhode Island School of Design. Without further ado, I want to welcome Brittany Salisbury up here on stage, and just a quick reminder that we hope there will be some time for questions and answers at the end. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Chelsea, for that very kind introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Great, I'm seeing nodding. So thank you so much for being here this evening, and especially for your membership to the Cleveland Museum of Art. And I'm very pleased to be able to take you tonight on a deeper dive into the museum's winter exhibition, Picasso and Paper. And so, as I hope all of you know, the show opened just last month and will be on view here at the CMA through March 23rd. And I hope that you've been able to spend some time in the galleries, and that perhaps this talk will inspire you to visit again. As many of you have probably noticed, it is an enormous exhibition and one that definitely benefits from multiple visits. There is a lot to see. And so, oh no. Does anyone let's see if I can move it this way. Okay, there we go. Crisis averted. No, crisis reinstilled. Okay, crisis averted. So, to begin with just a bit of backstory, Picasso and Paper was organized by the CMA in collaboration with the Royal Academy of Arts in London with the support of the Musée National Picasso in Paris. And it was on view in London, and you're seeing just a few examples of what that looked like here, for just over a month in early 2020, unfortunate timing, before museums worldwide closed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And as the pandemic dragged on, the show was postponed indefinitely here in Cleveland and was finally rescheduled for this year. So that is all to say that it's a show that's been a long time in the making, and in this case for nearly a decade. Try this again. Great. So here you're seeing just a few images of what the show looks like in our iteration. This is the introduction to the first gallery, and it is very substantial with nearly 300 objects total. As you've seen, it actually occupies both of our exhibition galleries downstairs, which is unusual. one more installation view from the show as it appears on view now. And so in the hour that we have this evening, I will give you an overview of the show and its topic. The show considers Picasso's lifelong engagement with paper and the ways in which this particular material was at the center of some of his greatest and most innovative experimentation. The exhibition is organized chronologically, which I think is really wonderful because it allows us to trace Picasso's long-standing fascination with virtually all types of paper, things from traditional artist materials, but also more unusual things like ephemera. And it does so throughout the course of his entire, nearly century-long career. And I want to also start out by giving a quick introduction to the Picasso Museum, which again was our partner for the show and is where many of the works are on loan from. You are seeing it here. It opened in 1974, the year after Picasso's death, to house a collection of about 5,000 artworks from his studio, but also from his personal collection. He was an avid collector. And these included works of art, but also his personal archives, so things like photographs, his correspondence, his papers, everything that he had in his studio. Picasso left no will upon his death, so his estate tax to the French state was actually paid in the form of these works, and it is the largest collection in the world of his art. Picasso on Paper draws from these holdings as well as other important international collections to give an overview of Picasso's extensive and prolific career through the lens of his interest in paper. A friend early on described him as, quote, lost in a mountain of papers, and Picasso used the material for a variety of types of art making. These included traditional uses like drawing, printmaking, and photography, but also experimental collages and sculptures. And here you're seeing him in his studio with some of these works in progress. And here we see him in his self-portrait included in the exhibition from 1918. He is an artist who has plenty of name recognition, but I think that it's still worth taking the time for a quick overview of his life and the reasons why he holds such an important position within the canon of art history. He was a Spanish artist who spent much of his career in France and is credited with changing the course of modern art through his invention of cubism. And here's one example of his cubist work from the exhibition. Cubism is considered one of the most transformative movements within the 20th century because it dispensed with the idea that an artist's job was to try to realistically represent something and opened the door for artists to experiment with abstraction over the decades that followed. Picasso and his collaborator Georges Braque actively worked to question the ideas about vision and about perception that had governed art making for generations, and we'll get into that more in just a bit. Picasso on Paper tracks this evolution in Picasso's work through paper. And as the exhibition reveals, despite the fact that he went on to become a hero of the avant-garde, Picasso started out with traditional training, which would play an important role throughout his entire career. His father worked in the arts as a drawing instructor and a curator, so he had the benefit of someone who recognized his talent early on and supported him. Often repeated within Picasso lore is the story about how his very first word as a young child was pencil in Spanish. In one of the very earliest drawings from the exhibition, we see him sketching from a plaster cast as a 12-year-old. And this was an advanced exercise undertaken by art students, which he was already doing at this young age. And we can already very clearly see the skill that he has learned in rendering highlights and shadows. Picasso's career took off after he made his first trip to Paris in 1900, after having a painting accepted at that year's Universal Exhibition. This show was an international showing of the greatest artistic accomplishments by each country, and so it was a tremendous accomplishment for him at a very young age. Picasso took several trips to Paris in the ensuing years and fully settled there in 1904. At that time, he lived in deep poverty in Maar, a neighborhood populated by artists and models. In this photo from the time, he stands in front of his longtime studio, located in a building called the Bateau Lavoir. While there, he worked prolifically, learned to speak French, and tried to establish his own professional reputation. By 1903, Picasso had begun his blue period, and this is where Picasso on Paper begins to very actively trace his work. The CMA's painting La Vie, which is one of the reasons why, which is the reason why any great enthusiast of Picasso's work is familiar with the city of Cleveland, is one of his best known works from this period. The painting was made during a trip back to Spain, and specifically to Barcelona, and shows a nude couple confronting a mother and child. The vague narrative is set in the artist's studio with 2 paintings. The young man in the couple clearly resembles Picasso's friend Carlos Casagemas, who had recently and tragically died by suicide. He embraces a girlfriend who had recently spurned him, leading to a period of depression and ultimately his death. X-rays carried out by the CMA's conservation team have shown that Picasso actually painted the composition over the painting that he had shown at the 1900 Universal Exhibition during his first trip to Paris. And so here you're seeing the verso of our painting, the back of our painting, with some sketches that exist for the original painting. Picasso on paper reveals the important part that paper, and specifically drawing, played in developing this composition. In the galleries, the painting appears alongside several related drawings, allowing us to see Picasso's working process and how he repeatedly considered the image. Initial studies make it clear that the setting was an artist's studio and show the evolution of the figures. The one at right was originally an elderly man, but that idea was abandoned. The young man was originally a self-portrait of the artist rather than a portrait of Casagemas. And so what this all reveals is that Picasso considered virtually every permutation of the composition before ever putting brush to canvas, putting paper at the center of his creative process. Breaking from the blue tones that dominated his work, Picasso also made his first prints during this early period, initiating a long-time interest. He worked in intaglio, which is a printmaking technique that involves carving into a copper plate and then inking it and then printing it. And he focused on similar subjects to his paintings. Here we see his first etching, The Frugal Meal. A couple with exaggeratedly long, thin limbs shares a spare meal of bread and wine. And what I really love about this print is that to create it, Picasso, again, he's like a struggling artist trying to make ends meet, and having a difficult time affording artistic materials, especially expensive things like the copper plate that you need to make an etching. And so he reused a printing plate that was given to him by a friend. And what this means is that we can still see the traces of the previous landscape from the earlier print up in the upper right corner. They're very faintly visible. And so, you know, the friend who he got the printing plate from is someone who has totally been lost from art history, but has this sort of important afterlife for his work through this particular print. So to create it, Picasso drew with an etching needle, but also scraped in highlights on the man and woman. So he was effectively working the image forward and backward tonally in a really complicated way of working. This print also saw Picasso beginning another trend that would last his entire career, which was collaboration. Anyone who has ever made a print knows that it almost always includes some degree of teamwork. So to create the frugal meal, for example, Picasso created the printing plate and then turned it over to the man who you see here, Eugène Delattre. And Delattre was one of the most renowned master printers in Paris at the time. He had worked with many of the Impressionists and other important avant-garde artists of the early 20th century. And he would have worked with Picasso throughout the process of inking and then printing to make sure that his design was translated to the page in exactly the way that he wanted. Picasso and Delattre worked together often throughout the Blue period, and Picasso sought out similar collaborative relationships with other master printers in the years that followed. Picasso's artistic style often changed alongside important life events, and in 1904 he entered his Rose period. This coincided with his new relationship with Fernande Olivier, who you were seeing depicted in this watercolor. She was an artist and model with whom he had a tumultuous relationship until 1912. Picasso's art at this time was defined by mostly pink tones, and that's partly due to the rosier tone of his life at the time, but also partly due to travels that he undertook with Olivier to the town of Gozel on the French and Spanish border. There, Picasso was drawn to the ochre, brown, and pink tonality of the architecture and the landscape, and it came to play a prominent role in his work. In Picasso's drawings of Fernande from this time, we can start to see the very beginnings of cubism, and such as in this instance, the abstracted oval of her head, which is formed by a headscarf. It is also worth noting that the Rose period is a great strength of the CMA's collection. And so in this particular gallery, we're excited to be able to feature numerous works from our collection, some of which are very rarely on view alongside very important loans. The Rose period lasted about 2 years, through 1906, and led Picasso to his earliest experiments in cubism. Late that year, he began his best-known work, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. The painting presents 5 nude women, clearly identifiable to viewers in his time as sex workers, posed before a drapery and gazing directly at the viewer. The angular geometric forms that Picasso used to depict the women were completely new at the time in the way that they fragmented identifiable subject matter. Like much of his work at this time, the painting style directly referenced the visual culture of non-Western people. In particular, Picasso viewed, studied, and even collected masks and sculpture imported from France's colonies in West and Central Africa, sometimes directly translating their forms into his own compositions. He did so, interestingly, while maintaining publicly that he had never seen such works at the time of his first Cubist experiments. Picasso on Paper features a gallery that traces the evolution of Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, providing a rare opportunity to see the many changes and variations that Picasso considered along the way to its completion in 1907. Pages from several of the 16 sketchbooks that Picasso filled while creating the painting reveal that the composition we know so well today actually transformed completely during its creation. Throughout these sketches, we can see that Picasso originally conceived of 2 men alongside the women, so that these figures interacted with the sex workers before ultimately turning their gaze outwards and completely transforming the context of the painting. In addition to these studies, numerous works on paper from around the time of Les Demoiselles d'Avignon's creation focus closely on individual figures. This reveals that even as he was creating one of the most revolutionary paintings in the history of art, Picasso was still following a fundamentally traditional process that involved laying out every aspect of his composition before painting. He was also constantly rethinking and reconsidering the work from every possible angle as he went. After Picasso completed Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, he showed it to close friends and colleagues who were collectively shocked and repulsed. One of his friends famously described seeing the painting for the first time as being comparable to drinking gasoline. That's something you want to hear. For that reason, Picasso kept it in his studio and didn't show it publicly for nearly a decade. In the meantime, he reached an impasse as he considered what to do next and returned to his sources of inspiration. He especially focused on his continued interest in art from West and Central Africa at this time, as we can see in this study of a small sculpture. Around the time of the creation of this drawing, Picasso had visited an exhibition of such 3-dimensional works at Paris's Ethnographic Museum, and it was a major influence from which he sometimes appropriated very directly. Picasso's experiments with Les Demoiselles d'Avignon led him to the development of cubism in collaboration with artist Georges Braque, and Picasso on Paper traces the important role that paper played in that transformation. In these early cubist drawings offering a bust view of Fernand Olivier, we can see Picasso considering the question of perspective and integrating multiple vantage points into a single work. Sketching and then fragmenting his subject on paper allowed him to transition from a recognizable image to complete abstraction, as in the works seen here. And in doing so, Picasso drew very directly from the post-impressionist artist Paul Cézanne, who had, in the decades just before, worked to transform recognizable and timeless subjects, so things like he loved landscape, portraiture, and still life especially. And he depicted these subjects using fragmented, hinging geometric planes. In doing so, Cézanne initiated questions about vision and perception, so the way that we see things rather than what we see, that Picasso tried to advance further in his own work. With Georges Braque, Picasso avidly took up this project over a concentrated period of time and in numerous media. These 3 works each show him exploring the dissolution of a guitar into geometric planes. Early on, he more straightforwardly broke down his subject into squares and included visual cues, so things like letters, music notes, parts of a guitar, so that we can identify what we're seeing. And he did so in a phase that is known art historically as Analytic cubism. Later, in a phase called synthetic cubism, he gathered geometric shapes together so that they cumulatively created a recognizable subject, often through the use of collage. As seen here, in some instances, he went so far as to construct a guitar from paper and cardboard. Picasso and Braque called this distinctive collage technique papier-collé, or pasted papers. They saw it as a means of suggesting space, but also of replacing typical forms of representation, like drawn lines, with fragmentary signs and symbols. Picasso used paper ephemera of all kinds for these works, including everything from wallpaper, newspaper, invitations, to tickets. Musical instruments were a frequent subject and one that Picasso saw as a stand-in for the female body. Ultimately, he hoped that papier-collé could serve as a statement against the strictures and the limitations of high art for the interplay that it created between everyday life and modernity. Alongside these experiments, Picasso also briefly became involved with theater and ballet around this time. In 1917, he collaborated on a performance of Parade, a ballet written by Jean Cocteau with music by Eric Satie. The ballet was led by Serge Diaghilev and his avant-garde troupe, the Ballet Russe. Diaghilev commissioned Picasso to design sets, costumes, a stage curtain, and makeup for the staging of a narrative about the failed attempts of three managers to attract audiences to their respective performers. So a metaphor for the struggle of avant-garde artists at the time. With a musical score featuring an unusual combination of typewriters, sirens, and airplane propellers, the ballet appealed to Picasso's interest in challenging the boundaries of high art. One body of work that I especially enjoy from Picasso on paper, which I think, because I think it's a little bit unexpected if you are used to seeing his cubism, features works on paper that Picasso created during the First World War. In an unexpected turn from his cubist experiments, around 1914, Picasso began to work in a neoclassical style, known for its very spare sense of linearity. This shift has been seen as a response to the chaos of war in its new sobriety and restraint, and it defined Picasso's work for about a decade that followed. He especially favored portraiture, including these examples showing his then-wife, Olga Koklova, a Russian ballet performer, and the Impressionist painter Auguste Renoir. For each drawing, he began by sketching in graphite, which he then erased and redrew with a charcoal pencil to create a confident and very precise line. In doing so, he drew inspiration from the renowned 19th century French artist Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres and his series of intimate portraits, which similarly depicted his social circle using a detailed veristic style. Ingres was an artist who Picasso admired deeply, so the series formed a tribute of sorts, but also a way for Picasso, as an artist who was always thinking about his legacy, to establish his place within the canon. Around the same time, Picasso traveled throughout Italy, including Rome, Naples, Pompeii, and Florence, and he began to make works that were more directly inspired by antiquity. This was his most concentrated period of studying classical art, and he was struck by its mass and permanence. In drawings such as the Spring, he approximated the visual style of Roman art, but exaggerated its forms and its scale to create a sense of monumentality. And I especially love this drawing because of its size. If you haven't been in the galleries yet, it's enormous, but also for the unusual technique. Picasso drew on a prepared canvas that was made for painting, using a greasy crayon that was meant for the printmaking technique of lithography. So it's a drawing that combines media from totally different techniques, and it's just completely unexpected. During the 1920s, Picasso found himself increasingly drawn to Surrealism, a movement that considered the role of dreams and the unconscious in art making, completely rejecting rational thought. This was, of course, yet another dramatic shift, this time from the clean rationality of his neoclassical period. It's also a shift that might be less familiar to some, since Picasso isn't an artist typically associated with Surrealism. His connection to the movement was due in part to his developing romantic relationship with Dora Maar, who was an influential and accomplished surrealist photographer who you're seeing him with here. By 1925, the surrealist leader, a poet named André Breton, declared of Picasso that, quote, "We proudly claim him as one of us." Members of the group saw him as a kind of hero for the fact that, in his own words, he painted subjects as he thought them, not as he saw them. In 1926, he exhibited a series of guitars incorporating elements such as newspaper and cardboard in an important surrealist group show. Their uncanny combination of materials, so things like strings that can't be plucked and sharp nails that strongly discourage playing, aligned directly with the irrationality of surrealist ideology. During this period, Picasso also began a secret relationship with Marie-Thérèse Walter, a much younger woman, 17 and a half to his mid-40s, who he met while strolling through Paris. She soon became a constant subject for his art, appearing as the subject of actual portraits, but also works that more obliquely explore the trope of the artist and his model. And so here the two figures are barely recognizable in a composition that combines cubist abstraction with the irrationality of surrealism. Despite its large scale and finish, we can see along the unfinished margin at the edge of the painting that drawing, and therefore paper, was still at the core of Picasso's practice. Picasso was resistant to the idea of political art throughout his long career, but he was deeply affected by the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, a conflict between leftist Republicans and the Fascist Nationalist Party in 1936, and soon after by the Second World War. Partly influenced by the anti-war activism of Dora Maar, who was still his romantic partner, he began to create openly anti-war prints, such as The Dream and Lie of Franco, that drew on the long history of printmaking as a means of social critique. The Dream and Lie of Franco was originally conceived as a series of postcards to raise funds for the Republican cause, leading Picasso to the unusual squared format that you see here. Its individual images satirize the nationalist leader, Franco, his rise to power, and his claim to represent Spanish culture by presenting him as absurd and destructive to Spain and its culture. Picasso planned for the printed postcards to be sold to raise funds for the Spanish Republicans at the country's pavilion in the 1937 World's Fair, but this seems ultimately not to have happened. Other works in the gallery devoted to Picasso in the war years explore the development of one of Picasso's best-known paintings, Guernica. Universally recognized as one of history's most pointed anti-war images, the canvas depicted the tragic bombing of a public market in a Basque village by the German National Socialists and Italian fascists, leading to mass civilian casualties, most women and children. Drawings for this iconic painting reveal that, as always, Picasso experimented relentlessly with the composition before ever beginning work on it. This study of a horse located at the painting's center, for example, shows us that at one point Picasso considered making the work using bright, vivid colors to create an impact before settling on its very distinctive monochromatic palette of grays, blacks, and white. While creating such works, which commented on universal experience, he also explored his personal life and others, such as women at their toilette, one of his most monumental works on paper. And it is worth noting that the exhibition of this particular work in Picasso on paper is its first display ever in the United States. It's the first time it's ever traveled here. And if you've seen it in the galleries and seen how large it is, you can imagine some of the reasons why. And so this view gives you a good sense of the scale of the work if you haven't seen it yet. Picasso cut and layered a wide variety of paper materials, working especially with a variety of wallpapers. He pasted them onto a paper support, making additions in paint to create this massive image of the three women in his life at the time: his younger partner of a decade, Marie-Thérèse Walter, his romantic partner, Dora Maar, and his estranged wife, Olga Koklova. The work was originally commissioned from the artist as a design for a tapestry, but Picasso kept it in his studio instead. And as a result, the final work was only created in the early 1970s. During the war, Picasso briefly fled Paris for the rural French coast, and this period saw him making some of his most experimental works from paper, given his remote locale and limitations on available materials. So here you're seeing one of numerous examples of torn paper shapes that he created from materials that he had on hand, things like napkins and tablecloths for his friends and family, just as a means of entertainment and formal experimentation during a particularly challenging time. The end of World War II brought about another return to order in Picasso's art, this time through tradition. Late in life, during the 1950s and 60s, Picasso produced a body of work in which he considered two iconic paintings from French modern art history. The 19th century Romantic painter Eugène Delacroix's Women of Algiers and Impressionist Edouard Manet's Luncheon on the Grass. And here you're seeing some of the wide range of works that he created based on Delacroix's Women of Algiers. His series on the work ultimately included 15 paintings, 100 drawings, and many more prints. Picasso studied the painting weekly at Paris's Musée du Louvre, and when asked by a friend how he felt about Delacroix, he responded, "That bastard, he's really good." I love that. And here we're seeing a selection of the many works he created after Manet. Both Delacroix and Manet were recognized within the canon for changing the course of modern art through their transformative subject matter and formal experimentation. So by aligning himself with these particular artists and their work, Picasso was very clearly trying to articulate his place within a broader art historical lineage and thinking very pointedly toward the end of his life about his own legacy. One of the final galleries of Picasso on paper offers a very expansive view of Picasso's chosen materials and techniques, which often push the limits of established practice. And this particular space creates an opportunity that I especially love to consider Picasso's collaborative relationships with some of the women who are more frequently depicted as his models or as his lovers. Françoise Gillot, for example, was depicted by Picasso numerous times and was a very frequent subject for his work, but was also an incredibly talented artist in her own right, had a very long career, and the two had a symbiotic creative relationship. In the gallery, we see Picasso and Gillot considering the same subject. Here's images of the image of Gillot herself in a portrait and a self-portrait. So just allowing us to see the ways in which they actually drew inspiration from each other. The exhibition, this particular gallery of the exhibition, also features some really wonderfully experimental and unexpectedly playful works, which I think is really great. I think we tend to think of Picasso as a very intellectual artist because of cubism, and so these moments where we can see his more playful side are really fun. And so in this, he created this lithograph of his two children, Paloma and Claude, using his own fingertips. And so to depict Paloma, he drew his finger, he essentially finger painted on a lithographic stone using ink. And to show Claude, he accumulated dense layers of fingerprints that collectively add up to the young boy's face. Likewise, a series of lithographs thought to depict François Gillot and Dora Maar demonstrates Picasso's unusually experimental approach to printmaking techniques. The 4 images that you see here are from a series of 10 in which he edited a drawing created on a lithographic stone. And so this was an incredibly difficult process that involved, essentially resurfacing the stone and redrawing each time. Most artists just didn't do it because it was too complicated. But what this did was it allowed him to transform what began as a realistic depiction to one that was defined by cubist abstraction. In 1961, following a major surgery that made him begin to more seriously consider his own mortality, Picasso moved to the south of France, where he set up what would become his final studio. There, paper remained central to his working process, and he used it for both sketches, but also finished works like this carefully considered portrait of his wife, Jacqueline Roch, made from a folded and cut sheet of paper. Picasso met Roch during her work as a salesperson at the studio where he made ceramics. They became romantically involved, but she also became essential to his productivity, and she helped him with administrative tasks to ensure that he could remain as productive as possible during what would become his final years. To make prints, for instance, Picasso worked on multiple plates in a single day, which he would then give back to Roque for her annotations before she would then transport them to his printer and then wait for their return with revisions for Picasso to consider so that he could work essentially nonstop on multiple compositions at the same time without interruption. And so you're seeing Picasso and Roque in their home in this photograph with what I think was one of the best dog names, Lump, their dachshund. I love it. During his last decade, Picasso collaborated closely with two master printers, Aldo and Piero Cromlink. With them, he established a print shop at his villa in 1963, which allowed him to work essentially as he pleased, without any kinds of limitations. During this focus period, he produced about 750 prints. This is an incredible number of prints, if you haven't made them yourself before. And this reflects on his incredibly intense and nearly unprecedented productivity at the time. In this late print from his Suite 347, which is titled for the number of prints that it contained, we can see Picasso meditating on his own reputation at the end of his life. He presents himself before an anonymous but staring crowd and the subject of work from his early career, so this is the circus at the center, which he had depicted earlier on. And in this seemingly straightforward self-portrait, we see him revisiting his own work, but also meditating on the struggles of creative process and reputation creation. And these are two prevailing concerns that recur, throughout his entire life, but most clearly through his use of paper over the course of nearly a century. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take a few questions. Again, do we have microphones for questions, or are we?
Yes, on the way.
I see microphones, I think, maybe. Yes, great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How popular was Picasso as early as the Blue period? How much pent-up demand was there for his work?
He is like a rare example of an artist who was very successful early on in his life. As early as his early trips to Paris, he was already building a relationship and already established dealers, within the first decade or so of his career. And so, during the Blue period, he was kind of famously struggling to support himself, but it was a relatively brief struggle for him, and he worked with some of the best known dealers of his time. Ambroise Vollard was his dealer for some time. He was a dealer who also worked with many of the Impressionists, the Post-Impressionists, so people like Cézanne and Matisse, and he eventually he worked very closely with another dealer named Henry Daniel Kahnweiler, who really helped to build his reputation and to build a reputation for cubism. So very early on, he was able to be successful. Sorry, I see many hands, and I'm just kind of looking at the microphone. Yeah, so we have, the question was about the process of moving and transporting the works of art in the exhibition. So we have someone whose full-time job is coordinating the logistics of works that come to the museum and are part of any exhibition that we do. So the works travel from their respective institutions to Cleveland by plane and then often by truck, and with staff. Typically with staff, curators, conservators, registrars from the lending institution who will be there to make sure that every part of the process goes flawlessly. And, with an institution who, organizes as many exhibitions as we do on the scale that we do, we kind of have it down to a science at this point. But then things like that giant collage will kind of always throw people for a loop. So it's definitely a process. And for the most part, every individual work of art is a conversation and a whole chain of emails and an entire, process of figuring out how exactly it will get here most safely and how it will be installed. So this is why, exhibitions are typically organized about 5 years out. I would say that's about the average.
So
Sorry.
I've got the microphone, so let me
Yeah,
ask a question.
Sorry.
My question is about the paper that Picasso used. I saw the exhibit with my daughter who said, what about this paper? She was studying it, looking at it sideways, and the question that she raises, was he particular about the paper? I know he used lots of kinds of paper, but were there particular providers of paper? Were there particular thicknesses or weight of paper that he sought out or had in ready supplies?
Yeah, that's a really good question. He was very knowledgeable about paper. You may have, if you've been in the exhibition, you may have seen in the gallery about his materials and techniques. We actually have his paper sample books on display. So we had these books that you could get from, a paper manufacturers that would show you every color of paper they made, every texture, every thickness. So anytime he was going to buy materials, he had those to consult and could decide exactly the type of paper that he wanted to use. And so one of the things I think is fascinating about him is that he had this incredibly rich and nuanced understanding of the materials available to artists and really used that in his practice, but he also just liked weird random papers. Like there's drawings in the exhibition that he made on newspaper. He drew on wallpaper. He drew on pages of books. So he was kind of like an equal opportunity user of papers. Any kind of paper, just like he could look at it and identify something about it that was interesting to him, think about the way that it might work for him. And, as someone who works on artists who work on paper, I can't think, there are very few examples of other artists who really thought about paper in such a specific way and really had such an appreciation of and understanding of the properties of individual types of paper. But he did, he used wove papers, he used laid papers, he seems to have specific types that he would go back to, but really just wanted to try to use everything.
I'm coming. Might be easier this way.
Hi there.
Hi.
So something that caught my attention during your presentation was that you said that Picasso shifted towards more of a neoclassical style during the Spanish Civil War and the Second World War, when in my head I would have thought that would have spurred him to experiment more with his cubism and the more experimental art forms. Why do you think that is?
So it was during the First World War that he went back to neoclassicism. And there are a few explanations that art historians have kind of come up with for why he might have done that. The prevailing theory is that it was this really chaotic time, and one of the ways that he could create a sense of order in his world was by working in this very conservative style. One idea is also that maybe he felt that it was, at a time when France, which is his adopted country, was at war, he, as a patriotic gesture of sorts, he could look back at the artists I showed, Jean-Auguste Dominique Eng, who was thought of as, the great French artist. So, at a time when France is experiencing difficulty, he can show his support by looking to the greats of French art history. And I think also, on a more personal level, we can just think of him as, at this time, he is a successful artist. He has kind of developed Cubism as his own brand. It's gone on through multiple different styles. And I think, people speculate that maybe he was wondering if it had run its course, wondering, many other artists were doing it at that point. So maybe he wanted to do something else that he thought could be his own and could be distinctive, to sort of break apart from the other, what he may have seen as the commercialization of Cubism at that time. So there's like a few different theories. We don't have like a real definite answer, but we love to speculate.
Hi, thank you very much
Thank you.
for your lecture. My question is, how did the Cleveland Museum of Art come to acquire so many of the initial paintings and drawings that we saw at the beginning of the exhibit?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Usually that's a question I really love because there's usually like a really good answer. There's like one person who recognized early on that we had to collect Picasso. In the case of our Rose Period works, we're just really lucky. The Rose Period works and for the most part, the Blue Period works came in through different donors at different times. And, some were gifts, some were purchases. Sometimes when you think about building a museum collection, one way you can think about it is, you have a great strength in one thing, so it makes sense to continue building on that strength. And so that's one, possible explanation over the course of the earlier 20th century, when it was more possible than it is today for institutions to acquire Picassos. That could have been something that we had. We started out with a small group of amazing works, and past curators built on that. But really, they came in from different places, which is really interesting in its own right. A combination of things. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You mentioned his exposure to Degas and Braque as contemporaries, or maybe in his earlier years. What other influences might he have had which would have led him to explore this kind of medium of paper as opposed to the other kind of works that he had, such as sculptures?
Yeah, so he had very eclectic interests. He, in his interest in paper specifically, two of the artists who he looked at most closely were Rembrandt, the old master printmaker, and Degas. And he knew Degas' work well. They their lifetimes slightly overlapped, and he actually collected. He built a collection of Degas' work. And thinking back during his final years when he was creating works like the one that's still on the screen and sort of meditating on his career and his place within the history of art, one thing he would often do is depict himself with Degas or with Rembrandt or show them together, things like that, kind of considering himself as part of this cohort of great artists who had worked on paper in the past. But also sort of unexpectedly, when he was young, he learned a lot about the history of art by studying great Spanish masters from the past at places like the Prado. He especially loved El Greco's painting. We can see some of that in his early work through things like composition and the gestures that he used. But he really had an appreciation for historical painting in addition to more contemporary artists, and that played out in his work throughout his entire career. Thank you.
I'm looking at his choices of the animal imageries, and they notice they're all kind of powerful animals. And does he have kind of a stable of alter egos that he uses for animals? And so, are there other big animals that he uses, or just the horses and bulls?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. he did an entire series, which you can see some examples of in the gallery devoted to surrealism about minotaurs, and he did sort of he clearly saw the minotaur as like a sort of surrogate for some of the issues that he was thinking through himself in his lifetime, and this sort of hybrid of man and animal, and the way in which those instincts, the human and animal instincts, are constantly at odds with each other. I think the Minotaur imagery has also been read a lot along the relationships he had at the time and the sense of virility that he saw the Minotaur as having. So that was the moment when he was working with the Surrealists, and so that sort of latent imagery was really of interest to him, and he kind of played it up. I haven't in his other images. I mean, he later in his career he made more playful drawings of animals, and I don't know that I've specifically read of anyone thinking that those were necessarily alter egos, but it's a really interesting idea, and anything is certainly possible.
Okay, one more question.
Keeping this print up has put an idea in my head, and I haven't seen any reference to this, but has anybody ever discerned any influence of Goya on Picasso?
Yeah, no, I'm sure that he knew Goya's work. I'm sure that he was looking at Goya's prints when he made his Spanish Civil War prints, and he, because of his father's role as museum curator, but also as an art instructor, he had this real education in great Spanish artists from the past, and saw himself as part of that legacy in France, but also in Spain. And yeah, so I mean, I can't think of a specific instance where he said that he was referencing Goya, but I'm sure that you're right. The connection is very clear.
Did he ever say that he referenced El Greco, which I think is very obvious in a lot of his
Yeah, El Greco, definitely. Any other questions?
Thanks. Can you say a little bit more about the drawings that were part of the payment for taxes? Was it just what he had in his apartment?
Yeah, so it was the contents of his studio when he died. It was the works that he had left, that he had kept throughout his life and kept in his own collection, by both his own works, but then his collection of works by other artists, and then just everything that he had in his studio. And he kept everything. There's a wonderful photograph in the galleries on one of the larger panel texts of a photograph of his studio. He piled up papers, every piece of mail he got, every letter he received. He kept piles of papers, and when he ran out of space on the floor of his studio, on the surfaces, he would bundle papers up and hang them from the ceiling. So like an intervention level situation. But he kept everything. He kept, many of his own works, and it was a collection that was rich enough, in such a substantial collection of his work, that it was very suitable for a museum. And the museum is open to the public in Paris. It's actually one of several Picasso museums in the world, but the most substantial collection. And if you're able to visit, they just did a major reinstallation of their collection galleries. They always have their permanent collection on view, but then they also have special traveling exhibitions or special exhibitions of works that are usually in storage. But they've just changed everything so that there's a totally different selection of works on view now than there would typically be. So, thank you.
Last one.
Last one.
Thank you so much, Brittany, for this wonderful lecture. Really helpful. I just wondered if Picasso, in his lifetime, ever indicated a particular style or a particular period, or in his life that he thought that he liked the best? Did he ever have any strong indication of that?
Like a period of his own work or a period of like other
Of his own work.
of his own work? I mean, I don't know. I haven't heard of. Like, I think that we can, extrapolate just from looking at his work that cubism was something that was really dominated his career for not only during his actual cubist period, but for the rest of his life. We can see inflections of cubism in so much of what he does, even when he's working in a style that isn't at all cubist. We can see he always kind of went back to it and would sometimes incorporate those sort of elements of geometric abstraction in his work. And I can only imagine it would be a hard thing to move away from. I mean, even in his own time, it was really widely acknowledged as this sort of transformative change within the history of modern art, and probably was just a difficult thing for him to let go of completely. I think it really just had a really strong afterlife in his work and was something that he probably wanted to continue revisiting and revising as long as he could. Thank you. All right, thank you so much for coming again this evening, and enjoy the exhibition.